So let me introduce our guest for the evening. Yuval Levin is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he holds the Death and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy. The founder and editor of National Affairs, he's also a senior editor at the New Atlantis, a contributing editor at National Review, and a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. At AEI, Dr. Levin and the scholars in the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies Research Division study the foundations of self-government, the future of law, regulation, and constitutionalism. They also explore the state of American social, political, and civic life, focusing on preconditions necessary of the family, community, and country to flourish. He previously served as a member of the White House domestic policy staff under President George W. Bush. He was the executive director of the President's Council on Bioethics and a congressional staffer at the member, committee, and leadership levels. In addition to being interviewed frequently in radio and television, he's published essays and articles in numerous publications, including Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, The Atlantic, and Commentary. He's the author of several books, most recently one titled American Covenant, How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again, published last year. He earned his BA from American University and holds an MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for being here. Happy Constitution Day. And thanks for sharing with me. It is Constitution Day, and I do think that's a reason for us to think about our politics, the state, the condition of our civic life. I'm really thrilled and privileged to have a chance to do it with all of you. I would just say the turnout sort of top on this subject makes me happy. I don't think this would happen on every campus, and I appreciate it very much. I want to take up with you what might seem like a strange subject in this moment, or a strange angle on the broader subject of the American Constitution. I want to talk about the Constitution as a framework for national unity. And I say that's strange because unity or cohesion are not how we might normally think about what the Constitution is for. Also because we're living in an intensely divided time now. And it can certainly seem sometimes like the American Constitution is more of a source of that division than a solution to it, because so many of our fights are in one way or another about the Constitution. For both those reasons, I think we tend to associate the Constitution with the problems of this moment. And there are voices now on both the left and the right who see the Constitution fundamentally as a kind of obstacle to a functional politics knitted by time, or is not sufficiently democratic, or too slow, or too cumbersome, and ultimately understand it as one of the sources of our trouble. And I think that's not quite right. And I want to suggest to you that becoming reacquainted with the Constitution through the lens of the challenge of national unity is an essential first step for taking on the kinds of problems that we confront now. Seeing the Constitution through that lens of cohesion and unity can help us, for one thing, to see what the stakes are in thinking about American Constitution, what we stand to gain by recovering some of the aims and forms of American constitutionalism, and what we stand to lose by neglecting our Constitution, by showing contempt for it, as we too often do. We're used to thinking that what we stand to lose is something like the rule of law, or that the alternative to constitutionalism is authoritarianism. And of course, there's some truth to that at the margins. If we truly test the boundaries of our politics, if we really turn against our system with brute force, and that's not unimaginable, and maybe it's less unimaginable than it used to be. So it's a real concern. But I think it's not the first thing that we stand to lose by treating our Constitution with neglect or with contempt. The first thing you stand to lose is our capacity for cohesion, for being one nation together despite our differences, for accommodation, for coalition building, our capacity for unity in the face of our differences. And that is not just a prospective danger. It is very much a present reality in 21st century America. We have already been losing that capacity in an increasingly divided and polarized politics. And I must suggest to you that an important part of the reason for that is that we have already been neglecting and showing contempt for some very important facets of the American Constitution. And to see that, we should think about how the Constitution approaches the challenge of national unity. That challenge is not new, and it was very much on the minds of the authors of the Constitution. It's the first goal that's put forward in the preamble to form a more perfect union. It's the explicit subject of the first third or so of the Federalist Papers, written as an argument for the Constitution. It was constantly, in one way or another, on the agenda of the Constitutional Convention. Unity is not the only purpose of the Constitution, but it was an essential purpose of it. And so the Constitution is in part an answer to the very question that we now constantly find ourselves asking. How can a vast, diverse democracy hold together and govern itself? Now, if that's right, if the Constitution is an answer to that question, then that would suggest that our time, our era of division, is, at least in part, a time of constitutional failure. And I think there is truth to that. But that should force us to ask how much of that failure is a failure of constitutional practice and how much of it might be a failure of constitutional design. And so whether a renewal of our politics, a restoration of some of our capacity for cohesion could actually require us to learn something from the American Constitution and its authors, to return in some way to its core understanding of itself. It should lead us to ask whether the Constitution might be for us more like the solution than the problem in this moment. To see the Constitution through this lens of unity could help us to see some of the most important things about it, and could help us understand this complicated, challenging moment that we're living in a little bit better too. So let me briefly sketch out where I think that could involve. First of all, to see the Constitution through this question of unity is to take notice of a very distinct definition of unity that I think would be very useful to us now. It's an idea that is particularly evident in the thinking of James Madison, who was, I think, uniquely attuned to the dangers of division and faction. This is really what Madison worried about. He outlined a distinct understanding of political unity that starts in a way from a kind of contradiction in his thinking, well, a seeming contradiction. On the one hand, Madison insists that disagreement about fundamental questions is inherent and unavoidable in a free society. He puts this point very bluntly in many places, but I think maybe most bluntly in Federalist 10. He says, as long as the reason of man continues fallible and he's at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. Period. That is, let people be free and they will not all think the same way. I think anybody who has been involved in any group of people of any size can attest to that being true. In any group project, if everybody is allowed to think what they want, they're not all going to think the same thing. And yet for Madison, that didn't mean that a nation of free people could not be a unified nation. And he insisted that Americans shouldn't give up on living as one unified society. Unity is achievable provided that we don't expect it to mean unanimity. And so what should we expect it to mean? Embedded in the Constitution, I think, is a kind of a classical answer to that question, an Aristotelian answer that begins by seeing politics as an arena for action, for common action. And so I would say, simply put, that for Madison, in a free and therefore diverse society, unity does not mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. And the difference between thinking alike and acting together is very well worth our thinking about now. This is not to say that Americans have no common foundation, that there's nothing we think alike about, no shared beliefs. Americans are not strangers to each other. And we do have some basic principles in common, especially some of the principles that are laid out in the Declaration of Independence. But although those very widely accepted principles, even in our time, impose some general boundaries on American political life, there's enormous room for disagreement within those boundaries, even about those things. Our politics is unavoidably organized around those disagreements, and it requires us to find ways to act together without resolving all our differences about them. But putting it that way obviously invites a straightforward question. How? How can we act together without thinking alike? I would suggest to you that the United States Constitution is intended to be an answer to that question. How do we act together when we don't think alike? Almost everything that is mysterious and frustrating to many Americans now about our system of government is a function of its being an answer to that particular question. And a lot of the dysfunction of our contemporary political culture is a consequence of failures of constitutional practice that stand in the way of putting the Constitution's answers to that question into effect. The answer the Constitution offers is not simple-minded. There are simple-minded ways to answer that question. You might say we act together and we don't think alike by just taking a vote, doing whatever the majority says, right? We're a democracy. But that kind of answer obviously endangers the rights of minorities and individuals. And precisely because we do agree that we're all created equal, and because we've lived a national history that too often has trampled over that truth, Americans know that although majority rule is an absolutely essential principle of legitimacy, it can also sometimes be a principle of despotism, of oppression. Majorities can be oppressive. And so our Constitution looks to help us act together when we don't think alike, while also balancing majority rule and minority laws. That is not a simple task, and so ours is not a simple system of government. It looks to broaden majorities before empowering them, to restrain majorities while also relying on them. It deals with these kinds of tensions by looking for a dynamic balance between competing pressures over and over again. That's its strength, but it's also why the Constitution frustrates us so much. It doesn't really let you do anything simply, and constantly requires narrow majorities. And we're living now in a moment when our majorities are very narrow all the time. It constantly requires narrow majorities to build broader coalitions before they can act. And that is frustrating to narrow majorities. And we all find ourselves in one sooner or later in contemporary America. Acting together when you don't think alike requires some basic kinds of political practices that the Constitution tries to enshrine in its institutions. It requires compelling opposing factions to bargain, to negotiate, to seek accommodations. It requires creating some space for competing approaches and answers to coexist. It requires administering the government in steady, predictable ways according to the accommodations that these majorities reach. It requires enforcing clear boundaries on powers of majorities and public officials. And that is the work of our institutions, of federalism, of Congress, of the president, of the courts. All of that requires a citizenry that is formed in some core Republican principles and skills by the very experience of acting together when we don't think alike. And looking at the parts of the Constitution through that lens, that distinct understanding of unity, can help us to see each of those parts in a different light than we usually do. Let me say just a few words about each of those parts and what they look like in that light to give you a sense of what that can mean. To start with, for example, we could avoid a common misunderstanding of American federalism if we understand it by way of this idea of unity. We tend to view federalism now through the lens of decentralization or subsidiarity. So we think of the states and the national government as layered over each other, and we think federalism encourages us to emphasize the lower layers, the state and local layers. This is a way of thinking about federalism that is useful sometimes, it's convenient to communitarians, but it's not quite right. It would be better to think of federalism as describing parallel governments, not layered governments. That they're separate is what really matters about American federalism, and the imperative of unity is actually a key reason why that is. American federalism is intended in part to reduce the number and the scope of political controversies that have to be settled in one uniform way at the national level, and so to lower the temperature of our national politics a little bit. It came about as a compromise at the Constitutional Convention between partisans of a centralized national state and champions of a decentralized confederation. The question was, are we creating one national government that's going to govern the people directly, and the states are just administrative districts like counties are in the states? Or are we creating a confederation like the European Union, where there are distinct individual governments that govern the people directly, but when they have common problems, they settle them together at this higher level of government? The convention could not reach an agreement on how to answer that question. And in a sense, they ended up with a kind of middle ground. a very peculiar kind of compound republic, as James Madison called it. And the key to it is that both the national government and the state governments govern the people directly, but they do it with regard to different issues. So broadly speaking, the federal government governs the economy and diplomacy and defense, which sounds like a short list, but it encompasses quite a lot, especially given the reach of economic policy. And the states would continue to govern everything else, including the core police powers of government that are most of what our governments do. This let our national governments specialize in a narrow set of national challenges, and state governments could continue to govern their people in their own way, in distinct ways, answering key governing questions in different ways at the same time, in different places. This has never been a simple matter, and obviously, in particular, the decision to leave the question of slavery to the states proves to be not only wrong, but also untenable, to put it mildly, and it ultimately had to be reversed on the battlefield for the sake of both union and justice. And the 14th Amendment was a renegotiation of federalism. It added the imperative to apply the law equally to all citizens, to the federal government's relatively limited set of responsibilities. That was a necessary rebalancing, and of course in practice it's taken a very long time to really put into effect. But with regard to many other very contentious, if less existential sorts of questions, separating government authorities offered and still can offer a practical way to allow Americans to live with our diversity while still forging a cohesive national identity. And seen through this lens of cohesion, what matters most about federalism is this separation of governing authorities. It's what allows for some genuine diversity in the ends and the means of American government, so that if we now think about an agenda of federalism reform, it would have to involve untangling some of the areas where federal and state power have been intentionally tangled up, like healthcare and education and welfare, and thinking about where these issues really belong, because as long as they are shared by what are meant to be parallel governments, no one is quite responsible for governing these domains, and we end up governing ourselves very poorly. Now, the questions that do need to be resolved at the national level are intended by the Constitution first and foremost to be addressed by bargaining in Congress. And the purpose of Congress also looks a little different in light of the Constitution's emphasis on unity. Congress is at the very center of the constitutional system. It's the first branch, not by coincidence. Madison said in Federalist 51, in Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. Republican government is representative authority, and although the presidency and to some extent also the courts are ultimately accountable to the people, only Congress is actually supposed to be representative of that. The framers did not imagine that a single person could be representative of the vast society. The president is elected to be accountable. Congress is elected also to be representative. And Congress supports the absolutely central institution in the Constitution's vision of unity. By representing our plurality, our national legislature can let us negotiate among the basic factions that make up our society. This is the first and foremost way, most important, in which the Constitution envisions Americans acting together even when we all think alike, by negotiating toward broadly acceptable courses of action. That's the essence of American politics. When it works, and I stress when it works, Congress can function as an arena of contention and of coalition building, even sometimes of integration, as the representatives of different American points of view oppose each other and are compelled to find ways to accommodate each other, to deal with each other in ways that can then reflect back on their constituencies. Madison took this to be maybe the most important advantage of representative institutions. The people's representatives can reach agreements and arrangements that the people they represent could not have reached on their own. The structured negotiation that are created by Congress are essential to American political life. That's a key reason why the Congress is not simply majoritarian. The U.S. Congress differs from the sorts of parliaments that you find in most democracies around the world today, because it doesn't empower narrow majorities to govern unrestricted until they lose their mandates. It's not enough that you barely won an election. If you barely won it, you have to work with the other side a lot to get anything done. And the distinct and overlapping electorates that choose the House and Senate, the constant threat of presidential vetoes, the supermajority requirements that you find here and there in the system all mean that narrow temporary majorities can't exercise real power. They have to deal with broad, durable minorities and build some consensus, build some coalitions before they can really get anything done. Now, that's there in part to protect minority rights, but it's also there to build consensus that can reach further than simple majority power, to make us more unified before we really act upon it. That kind of coalition building generally doesn't feel very unifying while it's happening, right? Negotiating processes are adversarial. You're fighting over something. But by compelling different factions to deal with each other, literally to make deals with each other, with the aim of finding some common path forward, those kinds of processes can forge real common ground. An effective legislative accommodation doesn't just give each side half. It gives us all practical experience of living together and acting together. It builds real cohesion and social capital. And as much as it is a source of public policy, Congress is meant to be a source of that kind of accommodation, an arena for working out differences in ways that can disarm dangerous divisions. A system with a reasonably functional Congress at its center is a system with that kind of accommodation at its center, and so with some desire and ability to resolve disputes through a shared framework. Now, needless to say, that is not what Congress looks like at this moment. And so it's not where our political culture looks like. There have been some instances in recent years of genuine cross-partisan bargaining over some key issues, especially, I would say, thanks to the filibuster in the Senate. But it's been too rare, and much of the time, Congress is dominated now by cultural war theatrics, by partisan grandstanding. The fact that Congress is broken is, I think, very widely shared now. Just about anybody you asked would say so. But if we all agree that Congress is dysfunctional, I don't think we all agree about exactly what function it is not performing. The natural answer to that question, the intuitive answer, is just to say, well, it's not passing big legislation. Whatever is, in your mind, the biggest problem we face, I can assure you Congress is not currently solving that problem. Whether it's our fiscal problems or immigration or the environment or whatever matters to you, Congress is having a lot of trouble addressing it. But I would suggest to you that there's a deeper problem in that. What Congress is failing to do is facilitate bargaining and accommodation across lines of difference. That's why we're not passing big bills. But it matters that we see the underlying problem, because if the core problem is Congress just isn't passing big bills, then you want Congress to be more efficient. So you want to give more power to leaders, you want to get rid of the filibuster, you want to make Congress more subservient to the president, too, so things just move. But if you think the problem is we're not facilitating bargaining and accommodation and negotiation, then you want Congress to be less efficient. You want members to have to deal with each other. You want it to be necessary for coalitions to broaden themselves. You love the filibuster, as I do. It's the only reason we've had any bipartisan legislation in the last 20 years. You don't want more power flowing to leaders. You want it flowing to committees, to members. You want to give members of Congress a reason to work together. So the diagnosis makes a big difference when it comes to prescription. And to understand the problem properly, I think we have to see it through the lens of the Constitution's distinct understanding of unity and cohesion. Seeing that more clearly can help us to grasp how improving our practice of constitutionalism could also build some more solidarity in our society. Now, the task of turning Congress's negotiated frameworks into functional administration falls to the President of the United States. But the President's role in advancing national unity is also not what we might first imagine it to be. Critics of the Constitution who are dissatisfied with how inefficient policymaking by bargaining and accommodation can often be, look to the president to act more decisively on behalf of the country. And some people also say, presidents of both parties particularly like to say this, that because the president is the only official who's elected by a national constituency in us at all, the president is also the figure who's most representative of the public as a whole. But I think this is totally at odds with how the framers of the Constitution understood the office of the president, and how we should understand it, too. The presidency is a unitary institution. It's one person. It cannot be a venue for accommodation and bargaining. It is a locus of action intended to execute the laws, to respond to demanding practical challenges, And the framers generally did not think that the presidency was a representative office. As I suggested to you before, it's an elected office so that it can be accountable. But they didn't imagine that it could be representative. To imagine that one person could represent our entire society is to imagine that our society is unified and has one will and needs only to be represented. But in fact, the opposite is more or less true. Because we are a diverse society, representing us requires a plural institution, not a unitary one. But the president does have a role, among his other important functions, in advancing national unity and cohesion as the Constitution sees it. The president, this is very striking when you look at the writings of the framers of the Constitution. The president is meant to do this by providing a stable backdrop for national life. Stability, consistency, predictability, not words we now often associate with our presidents, are what Alexander Hamilton called steady administration, is the essence of the president's role under the Constitution. And it is an essential contribution to our capacity for unity, for living together. Stability is essential for social peace. Without it, it's very hard for people to feel secure, to make plans, to take risks, to engage with each other across lines of difference. Unsteadiness in government makes it very difficult for anybody to be a faithful, law-abiding citizen. And it's the president, because of his capacity for unitary action and direction, who really bears the greatest responsibility to act with steadiness, to avoid sharp turns, to avoid sharp changes of direction, reversals of course, even his predecessor's course, to keep our government stable and secure. Now, steadiness is not stasis. The president is expected to give a steady direction to our politics, even to some extent the Congress's work to set general priorities, to propose some legislative measures, to veto ones that he doesn't approve of. But in doing all that, his chief purpose, beyond the defense of the nation, is to turn Congress's negotiated directives into steady, consistent administrative action. The framers' emphasis on that point is unmistakable. And here, too, our contemporary constitutional practice has become totally disconnected from its intended aims. We've come to think of the president as speaking for a party more than as acting for the country. And a change of party in the White House now leads to a really nasty kind of whiplash, as a new president spends half his time undoing his predecessor's administrative actions and the other half taking his own actions that his successor is going to undo. That obviously undermines the work of steady administration, but it's at least as harmful to our society's ability to be unified. It vastly increases the stakes of presidential elections. It encourages us to see our society as just two opposing camps competing for the instruments of power. So reining in the power of the executive and the administrative state is not just a matter of constraining government power over our lives. It would offer us a way to recover the capacity of our governing institutions to forge some common ground in American life, the capacity of the president to secure some stability for our public life. It's essential for understanding the nature of the executive's role in the life of a diverse and often divided society. The courts, the third branch, are also central to making greater unity possible in our country, but again, not quite in the way that we might first imagine. The crucial service that they provide on that front is not the resolution of disputes that divide our society. Courts obviously do resolve disputes, that's what they do, but they're intended to resolve disputes about what the law is, not what it should be. And so they're not the proper place for mediating among competing visions of the public good of our society. Our great public disputes over what the law should be need to be resolved through the work of the legislation, and in a very different way from how a court resolves disputes. What the courts then do is make sure that those negotiated frameworks of law are carried out properly. So the most valuable service that the courts provide to the cause of national unity, as I've described here, is in their policing of the rules and boundaries of constitutionalism. The federal courts have enormous counter-majoritarian power, which makes them very dangerous in a republic. It is absolutely crucial that power like that be used to guard the structure of the system, to keep elected officials focused on their proper work. That's a restrained role for the court, but it's also a restraining role. It's going to matter enormously in the coming years in American life. And playing that part properly He's going to take a lot of what Alexander Hamilton in Farrell 78 called an uncommon portion of fortitude in a justice to do their duty as faithful guardians of the Constitution. That assertively restrained role has been a subject of debate among scholars of the judiciary in the past couple of generations. The idea that this is the nature of the court's role has been an idea advanced by a kind of conservative judicial revolution, thinking about what judges should do. Now, the right today may be in the process of forgetting that role and its limits, but the courts must not forget it. They will need to be assertively restrained in the coming years if they're going to play the part that's required of them to sustain the possibility of a unifying constitutionalism. The temptation to use the courts to decisively resolve divisive national disputes is obviously enormous. In court, you just win. You don't have to deal with other people. And that's attractive. But giving in to that temptation has historically been a terrible mistake. Elite fiats are not a way to solve disputes in our society, whatever elite they might have come from. They usually only deepen our divisions, and we've seen that happens. The courts instead have to protect the space in which genuine resolution can happen, and especially the space in which Congress does its work, while also protecting the rights of individuals and of minorities against majority power, as guaranteed in the Constitution. It can do those things by keeping everyone involved, public officials and citizens, true to the Constitution, bounded by its structure and its substance. The courts should prevent end runs around the Constitution, not facilitate them. But of course, end runs now are rampant, and none of the institutions of the system are quite working in the way that they were intended or the way that I've described here. I think that this is actually in no small part because the Constitution's vision of the nature of unity, as I've laid out to you here, has always been very controversial and contested. The idea that the Constitution exists to let us act together even when we don't think alike has never sat easily with some critics of the system. The deepest critiques of it have always been what I would call integralist objections to Madisonian pluralism. They argue that the system has to answer to one voice, one vision of the good, or else it can't work. Woodrow Wilson was the most articulate of these kinds of critics of the Constitution. As a political scientist before he was president, he argued that the framers operated with what he called a Newtonian image of government as a machine, but that in reality, government is more like an organism. It's like a living thing. And so separating powers, setting interests off against each other doesn't make any sense. Instead, our system has to be organized to respond efficiently to the public will as it's expressed through elections, by allowing majorities to govern unimpeded until the public throws them out. In other words, Wilson explicitly rejected the idea that it was even possible to act together without thinking alike in politics. The system has to have a unitary aim that ultimately has to be determined by majority rule. Contemporary progressivism is often similarly integralist, insisting, at least implicitly, that every institution in our society, private and public, has to be engaged in the same social crusade, no exceptions, no exemptions, and implicitly that there can't really be a society without a single comprehensive common project. There are some people on the right who agree with that now, who would just substitute their own ideology, or just the will of a president they like, as the unifying vision that has to guide the social organism in a unitary way. Now, I will say, this is not a crazy way to think about how democracy should work. The Westminster model, the parliamentary systems that we find in many democracies, work more or less this way. It's a legitimate democratic model of government, but it's one geared more to the demands of administration than to the demands of cohesion, more to efficiency than to social peace. And Wilson took that model as his goal explicitly. He was not blind to the need for unity, but I think he was deaf to the logic of building cohesion by representing plurality. Unity, he thought, has to be achieved by unitary leadership, and so above all by the president, who alone has the national mandate to speak on behalf of the entire society. That kind of vision points toward very different ways of understanding each of the key institutions of our system. It has no patience for the havoc and disorder of federalism. It wants the system to be ordered by national priorities. It wants a much more disciplined progress that answers to party leaders, that's accountable to coherent partisan platforms that voters can vote on. It wants to substitute orderly administration and adjudication for messy deliberation. It wants the president to stand in for the nation and wants the courts to make that happen. And of course, our system has moved in exactly that direction for decades on each of these fronts. Congress has become more centralized under the thumbs of party leaders. Presidents now routinely claim that they speak for the will of the nation alone. And that's happened under both parties. As a practical matter, for example, I think maybe the most Wilsonian congressional leader in American history was my old boss, Newt Gingrich, a Republican Speaker of the House. It may turn out that Donald Trump is the most Wilsonian president since Woodrow Wilson. But whatever might be said about the administrative and ideological consequences of this kind of counter-Madisonian turn in American constitutional practice, we would certainly have to acknowledge that it has made us more divided. It's made our politics more partisan. It's raised the stakes and therefore the temperature of our elections. It's closed off some absolutely necessary venues for deliberation and accommodation. And so it's left us with fewer tools to fight polarization and fragmentation. This Wilsonian turn in our constitutionalism is not the only reason that we're divided, but it is why we think our Constitution can't help us address our divisions, why we think it's a relic with nothing to offer. In reality, the Constitution was designed to address exactly the kind of problem that we're facing now, and it could make a real difference if we let it. Better grasping the presumptions and ambitions underneath the Madisonian system could help us to see that in our divided time, the Constitution is much less the problem than the solution, or at least that we need to let the logic of the system better inform our practice of politics. But ultimately, and this is where I'll close, there's an even more fundamental reason why the Wilsonian critique of American constitutionalism doesn't make sense as a solution to the problems that we face now. That critique in its different forms generally argues for a simpler majoritarianism. It argues that our system is standing in the way of change the public wants, and so it implies that our divisions somehow aren't real, that we actually are fairly unified, that are being denied what we want by the rigidity of a system geared to frustrate us. There have been times in our history, I think, when something like that may have been true, when the deliberate recalcitrance of the Constitution has been our key problem, when big majorities of Americans expressed a clear set of desires for an extended period of time, but were denied what they wanted by the rigidity of our system. But there have been other times when strife and discord in our society have been our biggest problems, when Americans were bitterly divided and viewed each other more as enemies than friends, and so been unable to form clear, durable political aspirations beyond getting rid of their opponents. And we are plainly living in one of those latter moments now. There is no broad, durable American majority advancing a coherent agenda that is being obstructed by the Constitution. Simple majoritarianism wouldn't be very useful because we don't have clear majorities for anything. Rather, our politics now overflows with bile, and each of our major parties views the other party as the country's biggest problem. Our problem is not that we are not expressing our broadly shared aspirations in public policy. Our problem is that we are not forming broadly shared aspirations. That's what we need help with from our system now. We need help in finding ways to act together when we don't think alike. That suggests that we're going to need to choose to prioritize cohesion and coalition building and the forging of trust. And to do that, we have to begin by recognizing that these are among the original aims of our Constitution, that today's intense disunity has been driven in part by our broken constitutional prowess that's undermined the means by which those aims can be pursued in our system. To recover those means, to better pursue those important aims, we're going to need to recover the understanding of unity that undergirds the American Constitution, to grasp its appeal, its truth, to think about reforms of our institutions in its light, so that rather than rush to reshape our institutions in the mold of our worst contemporary vices, we should let the structure of our institutions teach us something about what we're doing wrong to it, and should then think about how we might reform our institutions to better achieve their own highest aims. That aspiration suggests not only an agenda for reform, but a particular spirit in which we might approach reform. Citizens who want to see our society grow stronger need to approach its institutions in a spirit of repair, informed by a sense of what's missing and gone wrong, but inspired by a sense of what's good in what we have and can serve us well. This is a moment that tempts us to repudiate our inheritance, but actually requires us to renew it. Americans are often angry at our Constitution now because we sense that it has broken down. But if we could see that we have broken it, we could see that it needs us if it's going to serve us. By rising to repair it, we could enable it again to repair our society, to bring us closer together, as it was made to do. The work of healing our divisions in contemporary America has to start with the Constitution. Thank you. Well, let's take some questions. Yes.
He's talked about.
Oh, here you are, sis.
My name's Michael Weber. You talked about a president that provides a steady flow of change. I know some people fall under the umbrella of an energetic executive seat. Does that contrast with your opinion, with what you said, or does that really fall into?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think that, the idea of an energetic executive comes from the same place as the idea of steady administration. It comes from Alexander Hamilton and Pharaoh Zebedee. He didn't think they were contradictory, and I don't think they are either. But the energy that an executive is meant to bring to his work needs to be an energy directed toward the steady administration of the laws. Energy is important to understand in this context. I occur this way. I think one way to think about the separation of powers is to think about them in terms of time. Congress is intended to speak in the future tense. It uses verbs like shall. It writes laws for tomorrow. The courts are intended to speak in the past tense. They review things that have already happened and decide if they were appropriate. The president acts in the present tense. He's a person who gets the 3 a.m. phone call and has to decide now, given the law, given the resources we have, given the nature of this situation, what are we going to do? And that inclination to activity is what Hamilton has in mind by energy. And our presidents should be energetic in that way. But you have to recognize that part of what they're required to do in that moment of urgency, that moment of crisis, is to sustain the stability of our society, to not let things fall out of control. So that one of the purposes of their energy is to allow for that stability to happen. The president can't be a source of disorder in our soul. And our modern presidents, and this is not just Donald Trump by any means, our modern presidents have become sources of extreme disorder in our society. They create havoc, and they see that havoc as emblematic of their strength, but it is not. It makes it harder for them to achieve anything. And our presidents walk away from office now seen as failures by the public because they set for themselves goals and aspirations that are fundamentally legislative. They describe their own role as, I got elected on this agenda, and I'm going to enact it into policy. That is a description of Congress's job. And as long as our expectation of the presidency is legislative in that way, our presidents will be seen as failures. And so if you look at all of our modern presidents, right now in this moment in the present, we say, well, this president, if you voted for him, well, maybe this will work out. But look at all our past presidents for the last 50 years, say, and it's very easy to think of them as having set out goals they did not achieve, because a lot of the goals they set out are actually better understood as understandable. We've lost sight of what steady administration would mean. What would it look like to be a successful executive in that way? And I think we have to recover that sense and to relearn it from the framers and from our history, because it's really essential that we not set up our presidents to fail. And it's really essential that we not ask them to do the opposite of their job as we now receive it.
I'm Sam Schwab. It seems that the modern presidency has become a place for weak legislation. after the league oversteps sort of Congress or creation of laws, which creates problems with the power presidency. Would it be reasonable to say that to juxtapose that? Well, it's okay that we increase the power of the presidency as long as we proportionally increase the power of checks and balances.
Well, I think if we did do that, then the power of the presidency wouldn't grow to the degree it does, right? The nature of checks and balances in our system is that they establish a balance in a dynamic way, right? Our system stays in balance not in the way that the beams that hold up a roof stay in balance, right? The branches don't lean against each other. It's dynamic. They're alive. They're always pushing. And so if our presidents are pushing hard on the boundaries of the system, and Congress is pushing hard back, and the courts are pushing hard back, then the system can remain in some balance, and we can also find ways to change in response to national needs. The problem we face now, I think this is important to understand this more, because we're living in a time where it's easy to just focus on these big struggles between the president and the courts. But the biggest constitutional problem we face is not the overactivity of the president, which is a problem. It's not the overextension of the courts, which is a problem. It's the underactivity of Congress. That is by far the biggest problem we face. Because as long as Congress is not willing to step up to its primary role in the system, the other branches will. They will overstep. The vacuum that Congress creates is the reason why our modern presidents have overreached. And as long as Congress is not interested in filling that vacuum, they'll continue to overreach more and more. It cannot simply fall to the courts to address that. And what you find now, and this is very much a challenge for the current Supreme Court, is that the courts are left trying to chase after the president. The president moves very fast, and courts move very slow. And it becomes impossible to do their job. I think both our presidents and our courts are failing to do their jobs properly because Congress has decided not to do its job at all. And the biggest challenge we face is a kind of lack of will on the part of legislators to see core national challenges as theirs, so that they themselves, as president of their party, will say, well, he should set tariff policies, he should fix student loans, he should fix immigration. When it is their job, and only their job, to do these things. These are the legislative priorities. The power over tariffs is assigned to Congress by name in Article 1 of the Constitution. It is not ambiguous. And to delegate that power to the president is to decline to do their job. So I think that the hardest thing to grasp in this moment, when there's so much action emanating from the White House and in response in courts, is that it's the lack of action that is the problem. The lack of action from Congress. There is not too much conflict in the constitutional system now. There is way too little conflict in the constitutional system. And as long as Congress doesn't resist and push back and demand to own its own authorities, the system will be in balance. And so I think the biggest problem to think about now is how to change Congress's incentives so that it does its job there.
I have Walker Eats. What president would you say was most emblematic of what a presidency is supposed to look like, or what a president is supposed to be?
It's a great question. You know, the nature of the presidency obviously has changed a lot over time. The easy answer to your question is George Washington was pretty great. But George Washington was president a long time ago. The nature of administration as he confronted it was very different, I think, from what modern presidents have had to deal with. And I do think that we have had an increasing tendency toward a kind of gigantism in the office, so that even better presidents of the last 50 years have still, broadly speaking, claimed for themselves powers that were not theirs. I think we've had a few presidents who were very self-consciously aware of the need to act in ways that advance the cause of steadiness and stability. We don't often think of them as our great presidents, which may speak to why many modern presidents don't do that. I think Calvin Coolidge, for example, is a great example of a president like that. But our presidents now do not look to Calvin Coolidge as a model, and it's understandable. But, you know, I do think that we've seen a number of modern presidents in moments of of real tension and crisis, say to Congress, this is your job. Ronald Reagan did that in some key moments. Jimmy Carter did that too in some key moments. I think there were times when George W. Bush did that, asking Congress for an authorization for military action, which a lot of presidents otherwise have not done since the 1950s. The sense that we respond to a national problem by saying, I have to work with Congress to address this problem, is, I think, a lot of what we're missing. I wish I had a perfect president to point to in the modern era, but I don't. And again, I would stress that I don't think this is simply the fault of our presidents, and especially in the last 30 years or so, which is not a long time. Congress has vacated the field in a way that has invited our presidents to overreach, and that's reaching at tremendous heights now in ways that hopefully can reawaken Congress to responsibilities. But I think it's going to take time and effort and some civic pressure and political pressure for that.
So in George Washington's farewell address, he warns future U.S. presidents and future America against political parties and interfering in European affairs. How would you say those two issues have affected the implementation of the Constitution today?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I actually think ultimately Washington was wrong about parties. And a lot of the framers of the Constitution came to that view. I don't really know if Washington would have come to that view, but Madison sure did. And the challenge, the question to which parties are answer is basically the question of how do we organize political action before democracy has its say? How do you select candidates for office? And how do you organize platforms to give voters coherent choice at the election? I think that there was a peculiar kind of moment of hopefulness around the time of the Constitutional Convention that this might be doable without parties in the American system. But no democracy has been able to function without parties. And our particular system, the American party system, over time has grown into something of a decent fit for the American Constitution. It's an unusual party system. It's generally been a two-party system, which is not the case in most democracies. It's a two-party system for a constitutional reason. So in order to win a presidential election, you have to win an absolute majority of electors in the Electoral College. So if there are more than two serious candidates to the presidency, it's very unlikely that anyone will win. And that the election goes to the House of Representatives. That happened twice in the 19th century, created massive crises of legitimacy. And after the second time that happened, in 1828, the American party system essentially was born through the work of the Democratic Party. Martin Van Buren founded the party system. And we haven't had an election go to the House of Representatives since then because of our two-party system. I think that system creates a kind of incentive for coalition building even before governing begins. Our parties themselves are broad coalitions, and a lot of the differences that exist between parties in European democracies exist within parties in America. I think that's broadly a good thing. There's a price to pay too, but I think it's broadly a good thing. So our parties, when they're functioning well, can help our system function well. I think our parties as institutions are very weak now, and when parties are very weak, partisanship becomes very strong. It's ironic, but the parties as institutions actually have an incentive to moderate our politics. Right? Our national party has to win elections in the Deep South and the Pacific Northwest. And in order to do that, as one institution, you've got to be pretty broad-minded. You've got to be a big tent. We're now in a situation when candidates essentially lie as independent contractors. They only have to win an election in their one congressional district. And there's no reason for them to build a big tent. So I think stronger parties would serve us well. Broadly speaking, the view of the framers on that question didn't turn out to be what, and I think they themselves mostly understood.
Thank you. Seth Spicker, how does the bureaucracy of federal government fit into your argument, as it's not really seen explicitly in the Constitution?
Yeah. Well, it is and it isn't, right? The Constitution does envision the president commanding some kind of bureaucracy. It envisions executive officers. It envisions departments. The first Congress immediately created 3 cabinet departments. They hoped that would be enough, and it hadn't turned out that way. But I do think that in envisioning the executive branch, they envisioned that it would be more than just the president and vice president. I don't think they envisioned the scope and scale of the contemporary bureaucracy. But I think that some of what has taken the American administrative state off the rails is that some of the institutions of it were not clearly conceived as executive agency. They were originally intended to take some of the load off of Congress. Their work was strangely in the middle between legislative and executive work. Some of them even have pseudo-judicial powers too. And that, I think, cannot really work in a system. So that Congress has to make a choice about where these agencies belong. I think the natural place for them to belong is in the executive branch. And so that ultimately we have to see the power of these agencies as power delegated to them by the president. The first sentence of Article 2 of the Constitution says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. Period. So all executive power is ultimately exercised as presidential power. I think that's the right way to think about it. That doesn't mean that all government power is presidential power. Congress ought to be more powerful than the president, but all executive power is presidential power. And I think to the degree that we've gotten away from that, we've lost the ability to comprehend our government within our Constitution. So I am of the view that the power of independent agencies needs to be reined in, needs to be understood as presidential power, and that ultimately that would actually serve to constrain and govern the administrative state, to make it accountable to some elected official. Otherwise, it really is unaccountable power, which is obviously a dangerous thing.
So when we bring in the topic of lobbying as you were to like necessarily find a way into push tenor, how do you go about saying like how that's changed from what the frameworkers of the Constitution would have imagined the RNC or even people who are able to fund certain aspects of the bureaucracy down to modern day contemporary Constitution now?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, this challenge of lobbying is a very old problem in the American system. It's a problem in every democracy, but there is a right embedded and enshrined in the First Amendment to petition the government for resolution of grievances, right? So citizens can approach their elected officials and describe their problems and ask that they be solved. The trouble is actually doing that requires some presence in Washington, some access to these officials. And from the very beginning, that's been easier for people with money to do than for people without money to do. And that is an enormous problem. I do think that some of the constraints on the power of lobbying that are in place now make sense. I think some of the constraints on the flow of money through the system make sense. But we have to think about those constraints in the context of what the system is meant to do, because some of them don't make sense. Some of the ways that we've restricted campaign finance, for example, have weakened the political parties very dramatically. The purpose of that was to democratize the system. The effect of it was actually to empower outside interests, so that money now flows into our politics through these darker channels that are much less visible, much less accessible to the public. Outside groups that don't have the interests the parties have, but have their own personal interests. And I think it's actually exacerbating the problem of lobbying in some important ways. So I do think there's a need for some reform on that front, and I do think that some of the reforms pursued in the past 50 years have done damage. Particularly in the past 25 years, even McCain-Feingold campaign finance reforms were very, very misguided in that respect and did an enormous amount of damage to American political culture. So it's worth seeing how sometimes well-intentioned reforms are the problem you solve. But obviously, money to access the politics is a problem to us.
Do you think it's harder nowadays or in the last 50 years for there to be coalition building within parties and cross-party looks?
Well, yes. There's certainly been a lot less of it. And I think the instincts for coalition building have been degraded some, so that the notion that a newly elected president and his party in Congress have to come in asking themselves, what members of the other party can we bring along, and what would it take to do that, to pass this big bill or what? That's not really the instinct now. And I wouldn't even say 50 years. I think in the past 25 years or so. What's distinct about the past 25 years, and this is, I think, a kind of ironic cause of the difficulty we have with forming coalition. What's distinct about the past 25 years in the scope of American political history is that we have not had a majority party. We've lived in a 50-50 period for a very long time now. Generally speaking, when you look at American politics, you find a majority party that's holding together a very complicated coalition, and a minority party that's trying to grow its own coalition and become the majority. So both of those parties are engaged in coalition, though. In the last 25 years, because we've been at 50-50, both of our parties have focused on getting out their existing voters more than on bringing other people along. And the more they've done that, the more they've forgotten that there's something else they're not doing. So the 50-50 feels natural now. You have a presidential election. The winner wins 49% of the vote and then says, this was the biggest, most transformative election victory in history. And both of our parties do this. That's what Joe Biden did. That's what Donald Trump did. You win a plurality or a very, very small majority, and you say, well, this is it. This is what we've been waiting for. We're now the great national majority. And we haven't really seen a significant national majority in a long time. The only real exception in the 21st century has been in 2012, Barack Obama's re-election, which he won quite comfortably. Every other presidential election has been extremely close, and congressional majorities have grown narrower and narrower. I worked for Newt Gingrich at the end of the 1990s. In the 1998 election, the Republicans lost 6 or 7 seats. And the day after that, we had a call with Gingrich, and he said, look, our majority is down to 18 votes. How am I going to run the House with an 18-vote majority? Well, the Speaker today has a 3-vote majority. His job really is impossible. And the ironic effect of that is we don't respond to 50-50 by trying to build coalitions. We don't say, well, we have such a narrow majority, you got to work with the other party. We say we have such a narrow majority, we have to keep every one of our people on board, so don't give the other party anything, and that's the only way that we can make this work. I think seeing through that is now the great challenge for American politicians, because you can see through it. It absolutely is possible to build coalitions. Now, it is possible to win a bigger majority. Not on the scale that we saw in the second half of the 20th century, but Ronald Reagan won 40 in the United States running for re-election. Richard Nixon won 49 states in 1972. That is not about to happen. Okay, our country is just much more polarized than that, more divided than that. But you could win bigger than these guys will win. Absolutely. By just trying to reach across the aisle, by just running a halfway tolerable candidate, either party could win 55% of the vote. For God's sake, pick any of the governors from either party and run that person. They win. Okay? It's not going to be down to 40 people in Florida. They win. So I do think that the opportunity is there, but the parties are kept from seeing the opportunity because the pressure of the 50-50 moment makes it very difficult to see out of this situation. And it will take some political courage, it will take some political imagination to do that. And so, yeah, I think it has become harder as a practical matter because of the dynamics of this very unusual political moment. There's only one other extended period in our history where we had no majority party, and that's at the end of the 19th century. It lasted 18 years, so this one's already been longer than that. And it looked a lot like our time. It looked a lot like this, with control of Congress moving back and forth all the time. Then, too, there were two presidential elections where the winner of the Electoral College did not win the popular vote. You had then, too, a president elected, then losing and coming back and being elected again. All the weird things we're seeing now happened in that period. And there's a reason for it. I think it's going to take the imagination to break out of that to get us to a place where coalition building is possible again. I will tell you, I think it's more likely that Republicans are able to do that than Democrats. The country is a little bit to the right of the middle right now, but either party could do it. And in order to do it, they have to see that this is the goal. I think that's what's kept.
I'll take the last question. So when I think about unity, especially recently, I think less about government and constitution, more about political violence. Most recently, the killing of Charles Kirk. And is there something in what you've said about the Constitution, its reform or rededication to it, that can address that problem, which is outside, I mean, almost by definition, that type of violence is outside of political sphere?
Well, I think maybe not exactly in the sense of reform, but the basic logic of unity, as Madison imagines it, has a lot to offer us in this moment, because it doesn't require us to stop arguing with each other. It requires us to start arguing with each other. I think it's very easy to imagine that Americans are just disagreeing too much in this one. But I think that actually the Americans are disagreeing too little. We spend too much time surrounded by people we agree with, talking about other people, and building for ourselves this mental caricature of what the other side looks like, and then occasionally some crazy person will break out of that caricature and take a shot at somebody else because they imagine that the person they're shooting at is this terrible thing they've been imagining with their friends for so long. The way out of that is to actually talk to people you disagree with, to actually engage with them. And everything now in our political culture keeps us from doing that. We live in these cocoons, surrounded by people who think exactly the way we do. Social media and the internet make it very easy to never get out of those two things. And our political culture increasingly works that way too. And for older people, cable television does that all day long. You just hear people saying exactly what you already think. If that's all you want to hear, easy enough. Well, that is very, very bad for democratic political culture. And it seems to me that the underlying assumption of the American Constitution is that our disagreements are real and they matter, and they can only be resolved if we talk to each other and find ways to see what we can do together, even though we disagree. That requires actually dealing with each other. And the easiest thing now is never to deal with people you disagree with. You make those people the subject of our politics rather than the substance of our politics. And that is a terrible idea. So I would really suggest to you that if you're interested in politics, you should actually get involved in politics. And a thumbs up to something on social media doesn't involve doing anything. That is not politics. That is a waste of time. Politics looks like very boring meetings with people who say things you think are crazy, who you then try to persuade to do something you think is constructive. And ultimately, we have to have a patience for that if we're going to survive as a democracy. So I think the Constitution can help us see that very clearly, even aside from specific people. Thank you all very much.